So we're up to the Mishnah, Daf Yomi Beis. The Mishnah is describing the halacha that we said yesterday, which is that the bread of the Toida Karban becomes Kaddish and has all the halachas of Kedusha. Let's say that it becomes disqualified overnight, and all these halachas of Kedusha Saguf. The Kedusha is Chal when you shech the Karban Toida. Now, what our Mishnah is going to be dealing with is what if you shecht and there was problems, invalidation. We sort of referenced it in the Brisa before, but now the Mishnah talks about it. Shachta chutz l'zmana. If you shecht the Karban Toida chutz l'zmana, so that's pigul, the chutz l'mkaima or chutz l'mkaima, or which is a different type of pigul, but it's not chayiv kares. Chutz l'mkaima, you intended to eat it at the outside of the proper place or burn outside the proper place, so it's not chayiv kares, but it's a lav. Kiddush halechem. The lechem becomes kaddish, despite that there's a problem with the shechita. Because the problem did not predate the shechita, the lechem becomes kaddish. But shachta v'nimtzas treifa. But if you shechted, then you find out the animal was a treifa, so it was never roy to be a karban. Like kiddush halechem, the bread is not sanctified. Shachta v'nimtzas balmum. Now let's say you shecht and you find it to be a balmum. So this should be very similar to the treifa. In the same way that the treifa was never roy, a balmum also was never roy. Yet by balmum it's a machlokes. Rabbi Eliezer am a kiddush. Rabbi Chacham am a kiddush. Machlokes are Eliezer and Chacham, which we'll see in a moment, is Rabbi Yeshua. So machlokes are Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua. Whether the bread is sanctified, the Gemara will explain why this is different than a treifa. Shachta shaloi l'shma. If let's say you shechted for the wrong karban with the wrong intention, so it becomes kasher, but it's not. It's no longer a taida. V'chein el hameluyim. And another example of shechting shaloi l'shma, where you have bread, is by the meluyim, which is the karban by the inauguration of the Mishkan. V'chein shnei kivsei atzeres sheshachta shaloi l'shman, or the two kvasim of atzeres that have the shtei alechem with it. These are all examples with animals that have bread with it. Lo kiddush alechem. All these are not kiddush. Now, by the way, the Gemara is just going to point out, why do you have to pick an example of the miluyim? I have a much more practical example, and that is every nazir also has bread. And the Gemara will explain the reason why I picked miluyim is because that's the first karban, so it's like nice that it's the first time it ever happened. Was a bread karban was by the inauguration. Okay, so our Mishnah had said that shachtan shaloi chutz zmane chutz l'mkaima is kiddush alechem, shachta treifa is loy kiddush, and shachta balmum is machlokes. The Gemara says that this version of our Mishnah is Rav Meir. But as we'll see, Rav Yehuda had a different version of the machlokes. Masis and Mani, who is our Mishnah, Rav Meir, and this Brisa, which is Rav Meir Shita, is mamish kimat word for word of the Mishnah. The Brisa says, Zahaklav, this is the rule. Kol shepisula koydem shchita. Any time where there's an invalidation before the shchita, like the animal's a balmum, the animal was a treifa, lo kiddush alechem. Then the lechem is not kiddush because it was never right to be a karban. Pisuli achar shchita, but if the invalidation happens during the shchita or following the shchita, kiddush alechem, the bread becomes sanctified. Now, by the way, I'll do this. Shachta chutz zmana v'chutz l'mkaima. If you shechta chutz zmana v'chutz l'mkaima, kiddush alechem, the bread becomes sanctified. I want to point this out. What does it mean the bread becomes sanctified? Well, it's apostle karban because it's pigul. It means it's sanctified that if you eat the bread, you chayav kares. Meaning the sanctification is that the pigul affects it, that it's now shaykh to be pigul. You understand? But shachta v'nim says treifa, lo kiddush alechem. Shachta v'nim says balmum. It's machlokes of the Eliezer and Yeshua. Of the Eliezer kiddush of Yeshua and lo kiddush of Rav Meir. So that's the machlokes according to Rav Meir. According to Rav Meir, mamash our Mishnah, the machlokes is a balmum. But chutz zmane chutz l'mkaima is kiddush. Amar Rabbi Yehuda says I have a different version of the machlokes. No, lo nechilku Rav Elazar Rav Yeshua shachta v'nim says treifa shel kiddush. I agree with you that if it's treifa, universally not kiddush. And I agree with you that if it's pigul, it's kiddush, because the whole point of pigul is that it affects, the shchita is effective that it makes pigul, so it's also effective that it's mekadosh the bread to be pigul as well. That everyone agrees, and so far so good. Al balmum shaloi kiddush. But unlike you, I don't think they argue by balmum. I think everyone agrees balmum is out. What's the machlokes according to Rav Yehuda? According to Meir, the machlokes is balmum. According to Rav Yehuda, no, the machlokes is chutz l'mkaima. The machlokes is if you shech chutz l'mkaima, does it mekadosh the bread? So according to Rav Meir, the machlokes is balmum. According to Rav Yehuda, no, balmum is like kiddush. The machlokes is chutz l'mkaima. Now Rav Meir felt chutz l'mkaima is the same as chutz l'zmane, that they're both kiddush. Kind of makes sense because they're both always in the same category. Chutz l'zmane, chutz l'mkaima, they're both invalidations with thought. You get it. But according to Rav Yehuda, no. That's gufa the machlokes is chutz l'mkaima. The Gemara speaks it out. Amar Rav Eliezer. Now, according to Rav Yehuda, this was the back and forth between Rav Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua. They're arguing chutz l'mkaima. So you have chutz zmane is kiddush, balmum loy kiddush, And the question is chutzim kaima. Which line do you draw it to? Rav Eliezer said, "Hoyel chutzas mani posel v'chutzim kaima posel. Ma chutzas mani kiddush av chutzim kaima kiddush." Rav Eliezer says, doesn't it make sense that chutzas mani chutzim kaima will be the same? And if I shech chutzlas manoi, which is pigul, it's mekadosh the bread to be pigul. So chutzim kaima should also mekadosh the bread. Rav Yeshua. Rav Yeshua responds, no. Hoyel chutzim kaima posel balmum posel. Ma balmum lekiddush av chutzim kaima lekiddush. Rav Yeshua says, I think that chutzim kaima is more comparable to a balmum. And the same way a balmum is like kiddush, chutzim kaima is not kiddush either. So Rav Eliezer compares chutzim kaima to chutzlas maneh. Rav Yeshua compares chutzim kaima to balmum. So the Gemara speaks it out. Continuing with the debate. Amar Rav Eliezer says, "Ani demisilim chutzim maneh, v'ata demisil balmum." I compare chutzim kaima to chutzlas maneh. You compare chutzim kaima to balmum. Well, near lemi daima. Well, let's see who's right. Im daima chutzlas maneh, nidenu chutzlas maneh. Im daima chutzlas balmum, nidenu balmum. Let's figure out what is it more comparable to, and we could agree. So his Rav Eliezer Lodin. So Rav Eliezer started to debate, and he said like this: "Dan psul machshava, psul machshava. V'in dan psul machshava, psul aguf." I think chutzim kaima, chutzlas maneh are the same because they're both psulim based on machshava, as opposed to balmum, which is a physical defect. His Rav Yeshua Lodin, and Rav Yeshua responded, "No, dan psul she'im beikaris, psul she'im beikaris. V'yichia chutzlas maneh, shepsul she'ish beikaris." He says, "I think chutzlas maneh is not comparable to the rest. Meaning chutzim kaima, there's no karis. Balmum, there's no karis. Chutzlas maneh has karis. So I don't think chutzlas maneh and chutzim kaima are comparable." He also says, "V'oid." Another argument said Rav Yeshua, "Nidideu shaloi l'shma shapasam machshav ve'im beikaris." He says, "I actually think that this is a knockout, and that is shaloi l'shma. Shaloi l'shma, there's no karis, and shaloi l'shma is a psul machshava. And you know what the halacha is? It does not mekadesh the bread. So therefore, I'm right that chutzim kaima should also not be mekadesh the bread. Not like you, who compares the chutzim zmanoi." And Shasik, Rav Eliezer was silent, meaning that was the knockout. He rescinded his shita. Rab Meir. Now here's the shayla though. According to Rab Meir, treifa is not mekadesh bread because the psul predated the shchita. But balmum is a machlokes. Why would balmum be different than treifa? Rameir, ma'isha shachta v'nimtzes treifa, that psul kain v'shchita. Ma'isha shachta v'nimtzes balmum, delay psul kain v'shchita. Why is a balmum? There's a machlokes. It should be universally. It's the same thing as a treifa. Well, how is a balmum any different than a treifa? So the answer is, we're not talking about every balmum. We're only talking about cataracts of the eye. And what is cataracts? Why is that different? Because Rav Akiva's shita is that if an animal has a cataract, well, you're not supposed to bring it as a carbon. It is disqualified. If you already put it on the mizbech, you don't take it down. So therefore, because it's semi-valid, therefore it's mekadesh the bread. That's where Rav Eliezer gets from. Meaning, Rav Eliezer agrees that if the animal's mamish, like missing an arm or a leg, it's mamish balmum, that it was never roy. Of course, it's not mekadesh the bread. That's not a shaila. It's dafka cataracts where he feels it's mekadesh the bread. Why? Because if you were put on the mizbeach, you wouldn't be able to take it down because it's quasi roy. So if it's quasi roy, then it's mekadesh the bread as well. Rav Yeshua responds, no. All it means is that if you put it on the mizbeach, you don't have to take it down. Who says that it's mekadesh bread? Who says that it's roy? Just because you don't take it off the mizbeach doesn't mean that it's a roy carbon from mekadesh the bread. The Gemara says, "Bedugan Shabbai Li Rav Akiva Damar." Amar Yerdu Rav Yeshua ki Amar Rav Akiva Amar Yerdu. Who said that it's mekadesh the bread? Okay, so you had a machlokes. Of, according to Rav Yehuda, the machlokes between Rav Eliezer and Rav Yeshua is chutzim kaimai. And do we compare chutzim kaimai to chutzlas maneh or to balmum? So the Gemara says, I'll tell you another nafkamina. Itmar chata sheshachta chutzlas maneh. If you shechta chatas chutzlas maneh, it's pigul. If you place it on the mizbeach, you have to leave it there. You don't take it down. But chutzim kaimai, what if I shech the carbon chutzim kaimai and I put it on the mizbeach? Do I take it off? So Rav Amar Terid, Rav Amar Lo Terid. It's a machlokes. Rav and Rav. You know what the machlokes is? Mamash is say machlokes. If you compare chutzim kaimai to chutzlas maneh, then the same way chutzlas maneh you leave it on the mizbeach, chutzim kaimai as well. If you compare chutzim kaimai to balmum, like Rav Yehuda, then the same way balmum. You have to take it off the mizbeach, so too chutzim kaimai as well. So this shaila of whether you take it off the mizbeach is totally in the shaila of whether chutzim kaimai is more comparable to chutzlas manai, or whether it's more comparable to a balmum. So the Gemara says. The Gemara says like this: Rava Karav Yeshua, V'Rabba Karav Eliezer. Oh, very good. Now, so Rava holds like Rav Yeshua that it's chutzlas mana is comparable to chutzlam kaimai, and Rabba holds that it's more comparable to Baal Mum, and you have to take it down. So it's the same machlokes as Rav Eliezer and Rav Yeshua we had before. But if you remember, Rav Eliezer was silent, which means Rav Eliezer rescinded his shita. So the Gemara says, Hader be Rabba legabe de Rava. Rabba also rescinded his shita because Rabba's shita is based on Rav Eliezer, and Rav Eliezer rescinded his shita, so the Rabba also rescinded his shita. The Hader be Rav Eliezer legabe de Rav Yeshua. Very good. The Gemara says one slightly different version. V'ikadamri, no, that he didn't rescind his shita. And he said like this: even though Rav Eliezer retracted his shita to Rav Yeshua, Rabba refused to retract. Why? He said Hasamhu in that case before of sanctifying the bread. One of the reasons why Rav Eliezer rescinded his view is because Rav Eliezer's point is that chutzlam kaimai is more comparable to Baal Mum, and it's not mekadosh of the bread. Rav Yeshua knocked him out. First of all, he said it's more comparable to chutzlas manai. Secondly, shaloi lishma, which is definitely similar, is not mekadosh of the bread. So that was his point. So Rabbi Eliezer retracted his view. Says Rabbah, that doesn't mean that in general I can't compare chutzlam kaimai to a Baal Mum. It means in that case specifically, be mekadosh the bread, there was a knockout because shaloi lishma, which is very similar, is not mekadosh the bread. But over here, if I want to compare this discussion of tered, of taking it off the mizbech or leaving on the mizbech, let's say I'm going to follow that line of thinking. I compare chutzlam kaimai to Baal Mum, and therefore I want to take it off the mizbech. Rabba says loiter. Rabba says leave it up because he's comparing it to chutzlam kaimai. He's comparing it to chutzlas mana. Rav Eliezer rescinded his view. Rav Eliezer rescinded his view because in that discussion, shaloi lishma was different. In this discussion, if I shecht an animal shaloi lishma and I place it on the mizbeach, I can't take it down either. Shaloi lishma is actually a raya to Rabbah. In that case of Kiddush Halechem, Shaloi Lishma is not a raya. It's on the contrary, it's a knockout punch. That's why Rav Eliezer rescinded his view. But he says over here, Rabbah says, on the contrary, comparing it to Shaloi Lishma is actually a raya to me. And therefore, Rabbah says, I first of all want to compare chutzlas manai to chutzlam kaimai, like Rav Eliezer did. And if you want to say, no, it's not comparable, then knockout punch to Rav Eliezer was because Shaloi Lishma was a wrench over there. But over here, Shaloi Lishma is a raya to me. When it comes to Kiddush Halechem, Shaloi Lishma is not mekadosh the lechem. But when it comes to Tered, I'm also like Tered by Shaloi Lishma. And therefore, it's a raya to Rabbah, and therefore he's not rescinding his view. Now, one last point I mentioned before, that the Mishnah is giving examples of shechting an animal, Shaloi Lishma, that it's not mekadosh the bread. And one of the examples was Hamiluyim. So the question is, why not mention the Nazir, which is a much more common application than the inauguration of the Mishkan, which happened a long time ago? Amar Papa Shavik Tana Didan El Nazir the Shriach v'Nakat Ayel Miluyim. It's Tana Didan Ikar Milsa Nakat. The reason why the Tana wanted to pick the Miluyim is because it's the first time it ever happened. There's a certain chavivus to that. Okay. It's like the Mishnah. Mishnah says like this. The Mishnah says Hanechos Hanesachim. Talking about nesachim, that's the wine libations, the oil, and nesachim shekidshu b'kli. Let's go with wine for a second, right? So you have the wine, you place it into a kli sharetz, the nimsa zavach pasel, and then you find out that the animal that it's accompanying is pasel. So yesh zavach acher yakriv imay. If there's another sacrifice, meaning there's a shlamim that becomes pasel, so if there's another shlamim that you could use the wine for, good. The imlav yifslu belina, and if not, then it's just overnight it becomes disqualified. Meaning, the second it is in a klisha race, we assume that it's already holy. So if you could use it for another carbon good, and if not, then by the nighttime it'll become disqualified. So the Gemara says, Amr Ziri, Ein hanesachim miskadshin el b'shchitas hazevach. The nesachim only become kaddish when you shecht the carbon that they're accompanying. Meaning, they're not automatically kaddish merely be placing them in a klishares. It's in a klishares and the shchita. My timer, what's the reason? Amarkra zevach unesachim. Zevach, the zevach is the shchita. That's mekadosh the nesachim. Okay, I'll just say it outside, and we'll see it inside. The Mishnah had said that if I have a nesachim in the klishares and there's an invalidation with the carbon, the nesachim are already holy, so use it for another carbon, or they're going to become disqualified that night. Now, it says if there's an invalidation with the carbon, the nesachim have to be used for another carbon because they're already holy. The clock is already ticking. Now, what was the invalidation with the carbon? Pashas, there was a problem with the shechita. So the shechita wasn't good, and yet it's still kaddish. You told me that it becomes kaddish through the shechita. The implication of the Mishnah is that it's kaddish even if there's something wrong with the shechita. Tanan, hanesachim shekadshu bekli v'nimtza zevach pasol imyesh zevach acher yikravu imay v'mani yifsa belila v'mlav yifsa belila my lav deifsa b'shechita. Are we not referring to a case? I mean, the case of our Mishnah is that despite the issue with the carbon, the nesachim are kaddish. Now you're telling me what makes them kaddish is the shechita. Well, what's the invalidation of the Mishnah? Despite the invalidation, they're still kaddish. If the invalidation is shechita, it shows you that shechita is not necessary to make a kaddish. The answer is like ifsal b'zrika. No, the shechita was taka fine. The problem was with the zrika. So taka, it becomes kaddish through the shechita, and the case of the Mishnah where there was an invalidation, that was with the zrika. Now says the Gemara, that means that you have the carbon that has the carbon has many components. That has the shechita and the zrika. And what's mekadesh the nesachim is the shechita alone is mekadesh the nesachim. You don't need the zrika. Says the Gemara, Kaman, Kerebi damer shnei dvar matir ma'ilin zev loizeh. If I was a sheet of Rabbi, that when you have two stages of that are matir, like the carbon to be matir, let's say the process, let's say eating the carbon, you need the shechita and the zrika. Those are the two stages. One is enough. So over here, I had the shechita. There was a problem with the zrika, but the shechita is already kaddish. And it's not like Rabbi Eliezer Bar Shimon that holds you actually need both. So Gemara says no. I feel it to Rabbi Eliezer Bar Shimon. It could even follow Rabbi Eliezer Bar Shimon, who normally holds you need both. The case is as follows: Shekibel damen bekais v'nishbach. Go to the next page. The case is where you had a kasher shechita. You didn't do the zrika, but you were makabel in the kais on the way to do the zrika, and then you spilled out the blood. And Rabbi Eliezer Bar Shimon holds like his father Shimon that as long as you're in the process of zrika, if you're ready to do zrika, it's ki'ilu you did zrika. So really, you had a kasher shechita, and it's ki'ilu you had a kasher zrika as well, and that's why the nesachim are kaddish. It could be taka for the nesachim to be kaddish. You actually need the shechita and the zrika. The case where the invalidation happened is that it spilled out right before the zrika. And the point is, even though you didn't actively do the zrika, but because it was kala oimid lizrk is kizarik dami. It was as if you were doing the zrika because it was ready to be done. Zak the Gemara Amr. Now, if there's another carbon, so let's say you have the wine, it's in the klisharis, something goes wrong. So we said that if you could use it for another carbon, use it for another carbon. The question is, are you able to do this? Just use it for another carbon? If oil was set aside for a specific mincha, you can't use it for another mincha. So why is it that the wine I could use for another carbon, but the oil of a mincha I can't? So says the Gemara, Rabbi, I tell you why you can use the wine. Leiv bezdin masan. There's such a concept called leiv bezdin masan. Leiv bezdin masan means that bezdin stipulates that it's ki'ilu. The bezdin stipulates that when you're mekadesh the yayin, it's ki'ilu. There's a tanai from bezdin. Bezdin sort of makes these tanaim to sort of help Klal Yisrael function, and it's as if they made a verbal tanai that if something goes wrong with this carbon, you could use it for another carbon. So the reason why it works is because it's as if there's a stipulation. Obvious question. So how come the oil can't do this, right? I set aside oil for mincha A, and something goes wrong, I can't use it for mincha B. But wine I could. Why? Because wine, it's as if there's a stipulation of bezdin. So why didn't they stipulate the same thing for the oil? So the Gemara says, it's a shemen gufa to minchu. The reason, this is a long thought, so we'll just do this fairly quickly. The reason why they didn't want to make a stipulation for the oil is because the oil is an integral part of the carbon. It's part of the carbon itself. It's actually in the mincha itself, as opposed to the wine, which is secondary, ancillary on the side. So the Gemara says, okay, so I understand that they didn't want to make the stipulation because it's really part of the carbon. So still, even if it's part of the carbon, why can't they make a stipulation that if something goes wrong, the oil should no longer have kedusha? Meaning, you don't want it to go from one carbon to the next because it's an integral part of the carbon. You really can't use it for another carbon. It doesn't make sense. You could use like the cherry on top, like the frosting on top for a different carbon, fine, but like the ikr carbon, you can't. So I get it. So they can't just stipulate that the oil, if the problem with mincha A, use it for mincha B. I get that. But why can't you just stipulate that if there's something wrong with mincha A, it loses its kedusha l'gamri, it goes back to chulin? Why not? You can't use it for a different mincha, but why can't you just make it this a stipulation that there is no kedusha? The answer is it's a bad optic, because if people see me walking with that oil home, they're not going to know that there's a stipulation of bezdin and something went wrong. They're just going to think, I guess a kli sharis is not mekadesh, and I guess you could take stuff from the Beis Hamikdash and use it for personal use. It's a bad optic. So says the Gemara, well, hashanami, the nesachim also there should be a bad optic. Then why can't? Then it's also going to be a bad optic because people are not going to know there's a leiv bezdin, and if they don't know there's a leiv bezdin, maybe they'll think that you could just use something for carbon A for carbon B, not realizing there's a leiv bezdin masal, there's a tanai bezdin. So the Gemara says, Hatani ben Tisyahu ben Yehuda kigon shahayis zevach zavuch b'isesha. You're right, it is a bad optic, but the reason why we're lenient is because the case is, let's say it's a shlomim. Shlomim A, there was something wrong with Shlomim A, so we're using the wine for Shlomim B. The case is Shlomim B is already shechted. So the average person doesn't even see the change. Meaning it's not like shechted for carbon A. The only carbon there is carbon A. Something goes wrong, and then they're like, oh, we need another carbon. They bring another carbon. No. That would be a bad optic. The case is where carbon A and carbon B are already shechted. The client is just literally taking the wine from like where carbon A is and just moving it to carbon B. Because they're both shechted already, meaning if there was no other carbon shechted at the time of the issue, I agree with you. The case is where the second carbon's already there. So the optics, it's not even so terrible because the average person won't even notice. It says the Gemara, wait, so you're telling me that it's only permitted when the carbon is already shechted? So why doesn't the Brisa say this? So why doesn't the Mishnah say that? What does the Mishnah say? If something goes wrong with the carbon, use the nesachim for carbon B, and if there is no carbon B, then let it belina. Why doesn't it say, instead of if there is no carbon B, it should say, if carbon B is not already shechted, meaning speak this out, it should verbalize this concept, it should stipulate all of it. Why doesn't the Mishnah say that? So the Gemara answers, that's what the Mishnah means. That's what the Mishnah means. When the Mishnah says, if there is no other carbon, it means if there is no already carbon shechted. That's pasha what the Mishnah means. Now, according to Rav Shimon, who is the author of our Mishnah, because we said that it follows Rav Shimon that kol ha'oim lizur kazarak dami, our Mishnah follows Rav Shimon, and it says that the reason why you're able to transfer the nesachim from carbon A to carbon B is because leiv bezdin masna leim. The problem is, I thought Rav Shimon doesn't believe in leiv bezdin masna leim. Misla Rav Shimon leiv bezdin masna leim. Ha'amar Rav Idi bar Ravin, Amar Rav Amram, Amar Rav Yitzchak, Amar Rav Yechanan, Tamidim shlehutzach l'tzibar. If you have extra carbon tamids that are not needed, l'dibra of Shimon ein nefadim tamim. According to Rav Shimon, you can't just redeem it whole. Meaning, there should be a leiv bezin masna leim that if these carbon tamids are extra, because they would set aside carbonos always extra as backups, if they didn't end up needing it, leiv bezin masna leim should be that the kedusha goes away. Rav Shimon doesn't believe in that. He doesn't believe in leiv bezin masna leim. He says, no, you have to let it get a blemish and deal with it like any other carbon. According to the Chum, you could actually just transfer the kedusha onto cash even when the animal has no blemish because leiv bezin masna leim. So you see, Rav Shimon doesn't believe in leiv bezin masna leim, at least when it comes to the Talmud. So the answer is shani hasam deisli takantabaria. The answer is Rav Shimon believes in leiv bezin masna leim when there's no alternative. In this case, when I shecht a carbon and I have the wine already set aside, there's no alternative. The alternative is throwing it out. So then we'll use leiv bezin masna leim. In that case of extra carbon tamid, there is an alternative. Let them graze until they get a blemish, and then transfer the holiness onto cash, whatever. Because there's an alternative, we're not going to rely on leiv bezin masna leim. Okay, new Mishnah. We're going to do this fairly quickly. The basic premise of the Mishnah and the Gemara is that you have a carbon taida, which always is accompanied by bread. However, there are some times where you have to bring a carbon taida because there's like a mess up. Like I lost the first carbon taida, got the replacement, and then I found the first. So there's going to be an extra. Or let's say I set aside a carbon taida who's pregnant, and then it gives birth, so I have to bring the baby also. In all these cases, when you're bringing the second extra one, you bring it as a taida, but no bread. The bread is only associated with the original, with the one, but not the second. Says the Mishnah, Vlad taida. If I have the child of a taida, so that means I set aside a taida, and it's a female, and it gives birth. So the baby also is a taida, and I bring the taida, as we'll see in a moment, utmurasa, but without the bread. Or a tmura. A tmura is if I have a carbon and I try to transfer the holiness onto another carbon. So I have a carbon A, and then I see animal B who's not holy, and I say, the holiness should be transferred from A to B. It's called tmura. There's going to be a whole masechta on this. The halacha is that it's aser deraisa to do this. It's aser deraisa to do this, and it's not effective. Meaning, what happens is A does not transfer to B. A and B are holy. So A is the original and B is called the tmura of the tamid, of the taida. The halacha is That's the second case. Or hifresh toida v'avda v'hifresh acheres tachtea. Or if I lost the carbon toida, found a replacement, and then found the original. In all these cases, I have the surplus toida. The halacha is enetun alechem. In all these cases, while you bring the carbon toida, they do not require their own bread. Shenemar v'hikrev al zevach hatoida, that you bring the zevach toida hatoida tun alechem v'lei vlada v'lei chilufa v'lei timurasa toida lechem. Only the original toida requires bread, not its child, not its replacement, and not its tamura. And not its tamura. They all do not require bread. So says the Gemara. The Gemara says like this: Tan Rabbana, just to finish up. Ma'u Amer Toida Yakriv. The pasuk says, why does the pasuk have to say you should bring the Toida? So the Gemara explains, it's mamish our case. Minayin, how do I know? L'mafresh Toida if I lost the Toida, found a replacement, and then I found the original before the replacement is brought. Varishtain this, and I have both of them in front of me. Minayin she'ezmen sheyatza yirtza Yakriv. So I have these two. I have the original and the replacement. So Allah is choose whichever one you want. They're both good. Pick one. The one that you choose is the official toida, and that comes with bread. And the second one is also brought, but without the bread. You might think that the second one also requires bread. Only one of them requires bread, and not two of them. Two of them do not require bread. Only one of them requires bread and not the second one. Now, so we're saying that the second one doesn't require bread. Well, maybe if it doesn't require bread, maybe you shouldn't be bringing it at all. Meaning, I bring it as a toida, but no bread. I understand no bread because it says yakrivenu. Yakrivenu means you only bring the original with bread. How do you know that you bring the second one bichlal? Maybe it's not a carbon. Tamalomer im al toida. Im al toida is to include the second one. Yachu tunas lechem, but again, no bread. Tamalomer hikrev al zevach toida. Toida tuna lechem. Leivlada chiluf leitimurusa toina lechem. So says the Gemara. Actually, we'll stop here. We'll pick it up tomorrow because it's going to be a cheshbon. It's tomorrow's daf.